Thanksgiving dinner, my son slid an envelope across the table and said, "Dad, I took care of the roof. Contractor's all set." My daughter-in-law smiled so wide I almost missed how her hand moved, just slightly, just for a second, toward her purse. I didn't think anything of it then. I do now. The turkey had been in the oven since 7 that morning, and gotten up early the way I always do. Couldn't sleep past 5, even on holidays. Made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake up. My son was driving down from Charlotte with his wife, and my daughter was flying in from Phoenix with the grandkids. First time all of us in the same house, since my wife passed 2 years ago. I'd spent 3 days cleaning, reorganized the garage, fixed the screen door that had been sticking since August, even got a haircut. My neighbor across the street, she's been watching out for me since Eleanor died, waved when she saw me sweeping the front walk. "Big day," she called. "Family's coming," I said. That was enough. My son arrived first. He's 41, runs his own civil engineering firm in Charlotte, and every time I see him he looks a little more like his grandfather. Same jaw, same way of walking, like he's got somewhere important to be. He came through the door, carrying a bottle of wine and a pie from some bakery his wife liked, and he hugged me the way he has since he was a teenager. One arm, quick, shoulder forward. We'd been working on that. His wife came in behind him carrying their daughter, who's 2 and had absolutely no interest in being put down. She kissed my cheek, said the house smelled wonderful, and asked if I needed help in the kitchen. I said no. I always say no. I should stop doing that. My daughter got in around noon, kids loud and rolling suitcases up my front steps like a small invasion force. She's 37 and still moves like she's in a hurry. She hugged me for a long time, which told me she'd been worried about me in ways she hadn't said out loud. We sat down at 2 o'clock. I said grace the way Eleanor used to, short and grateful, and we ate. It was good. It was the kind of meal that makes you remember why you built a life with people. About halfway through, my son set down his fork and said, "So, Dad, has the contractor reached out yet? I know I sent the payment in October. Just want to make sure everything's lined up before winter." I looked at him. What contractor? He tilted his head. "For the roof. You mentioned in August it was leaking over the bedroom. I wired the money to—" He looked at his wife. "I wired it to you. 48,000 for the estimate you sent me." The table went quiet in that specific way where everyone can hear their own heartbeat. I set down my fork. I haven't spoken to anyone about the roof. My son looked at his wife. She had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Honey," he said slowly, "what did you do with the money?" She stood up, said something about checking on the kids, except the kids were right there at the table, completely fine, eating rolls. She picked up her purse anyway, walked toward the hallway. My son called her name, just once, quietly, and she stopped walking but didn't turn around. My daughter looked at me. I looked at my son. He was staring at the back of his wife's head like he was trying to read something written there. $48,000, he said again, softer this time. She walked out of the room. The 3 of us sat there. The gravy got cold. The little granddaughter asked for more cranberry sauce, and I got up to get it because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. That was November. By December I understood the shape of what had happened, even if I didn't yet understand the why. My son called me 2 days after Thanksgiving. He'd gone through his bank records, pulled the wire confirmation, traced exactly where the money had gone, not to any roofing contractor, not to any account connected to my house. It had gone into a joint savings account that he hadn't known existed, one his wife had opened 18 months earlier, under both their names that she'd never mentioned. He found it because he looked. I imagine that was a hard afternoon. I didn't push him for details when he called. He sounded like a man standing in the middle of a room trying to figure out which wall to lean against. I told him I was fine, that the roof was fine, that the bedroom ceiling had only leaked twice, and both times were during that freak storm in July. He said, "Dad, this isn't about the roof." I said I knew that. What I didn't tell him was that I'd spent the night before going through my own memory, replaying every conversation with my daughter-in-law over the last 2 years. She was always pleasant, always asked good questions at family dinners, remembered my preferences, knew I took my coffee black and that I hated air conditioning set below 70. She brought my wife flowers when Eleanor was in hospice. She cried at the funeral. I kept getting stuck on that, the crying at the funeral. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a high school history teacher in Greensboro, North Carolina, which means I have a particular tolerance for things not making sense and a particular skill for waiting until they do. I've sat through a lot of bad behavior with a straight face. I know how to let a situation breathe. But this one had gotten into my chest and wouldn't leave. My neighbor came over on a Tuesday with chicken soup she said she'd made too much of. She hadn't. She'd made it for me specifically, and we both knew it. She sat at my kitchen table and listened while I explained what had happened. She's 72, lost her husband 6 years ago, has 4 kids of her own, and what I can only describe as a ferocious common sense about people. When I finished, she said, "Before you do anything, find out if there's something you don't know." I asked what she meant. $48,000 is a lot of money to take for no reason, she said. People with good reasons still make terrible choices. That doesn't make the choice right. But you need to know what you're dealing with before you decide what to do about it. I thought about that for a long time. I also thought about what I could do. I've lived in this house for 29 years. I know the plumber, the electrician, the guy who plows the driveway. I know a real estate attorney 2 streets over who helped me handle Eleanor's estate. I know how to be patient, and I had a lot of empty December evenings to figure out what came next. My son had already talked to a lawyer by the time he called me the second time. He said depending on how it was structured, there were a few avenues. None of them were fast. None of them were free. And all of them, he said, would require him to take action against his own wife, which meant whatever was happening in his marriage was now also happening in a legal office, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. I told him to give me a little time. He said, "Dad, she took your money. She used a leak in your roof as the premise." "I know what she did," I said. "I want to know why she did it first. Then we figure out what happens next." He went quiet for a moment. Then, "You sound like Mom." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "Get some sleep." I started keeping a journal. Not because I'm a journaling kind of man, but because I needed somewhere to put things that wasn't a phone call. I wrote down dates, amounts, things I remembered from conversations. I wrote down the way she'd moved her hand toward her purse when my son mentioned the envelope. I wrote down the fact that she'd called me twice in November just to check in, something she'd never done before. I wrote down the timeline my son gave me, wire sent October 14th, account opened 17 months ago, current balance unknown. I called her in January. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. I'd expected voicemail. "I'd like to have lunch," I said. "Just the 2 of us, somewhere you're comfortable." A long pause. "Okay," she said quietly. We met at a diner near her house. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She looked like she hadn't slept much. She looked, honestly, like I felt. I ordered coffee, and we sat for a while without saying anything important. She asked about the grandkids' Christmas presents. I asked about her mother. We were being careful with each other in the way that people are when they're about to stop being careful. Finally, I said, "Tell me why." She looked at the table, then out the window, then at me. "How much did he tell you?" "Enough," I said, "but not everything. You tell me the rest." So she did. 17 months ago, her younger brother had gotten into trouble. Not a small amount of trouble. He'd been running a side business that turned out to be legally questionable, and when it collapsed in the direction of $112,000 in debt that had his name on it in several places. There were civil suits. There was a creditor threatening to push it further. Her brother had a wife, 2 young kids, and was looking at the kind of financial ruin that follows people for decades. She'd tried to help him quietly. pulled from her own savings. She had a separate account my son didn't know about, money she'd set aside slowly since before they were married, just for herself, the way women sometimes do when they've watched other women have nothing. She gave her brother $30,000 from that. It wasn't enough. The debt had interest. The creditors weren't patient. And then in October, my son had called her to talk about my roof, asked her to find a contractor and coordinate the payment, trusted her with the wire because she's organized and he was in the middle of a major project deadline, and she had the account number ready, and she thought she'd pay it back before he ever noticed. She stopped talking and looked at the coffee mug. "He doesn't know about my brother," she said. "He doesn't know about any of it. He thinks I took the money for some reason I won't explain." "Why haven't you explained it to him?" "Because explaining it means telling him I kept a savings account from him for 6 years, and that I'd been covering my brother's mistakes since before we got married, and that I used money meant for his father's house." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "Where do you even start that conversation?" I thought about Eleanor, about the years she carried things quietly, the way she managed to love everyone in the room at once without any of them knowing how much it cost her. "You start it with the truth," I said, "even when it's complicated." She nodded but didn't say anything. I drove home and sat in my living room for a long time. The house was quiet, the way it gets in January. That particular winter silence where even the heat coming on feels like company. I looked at Eleanor's photo on the mantel. I thought about what my neighbor had said. People with good reasons still make terrible choices. She had used my roof, my leaking, aging, 2 bad storms in July roof, as a vehicle to bail out her brother. She had taken my son's trust and bent it. She had taken money meant to keep my bedroom dry and put it somewhere else without telling a single person the real reason. And she had been carrying all of it alone for 17 months. That didn't make it right. I want to be clear about that. There is no version of this story where what she did was right. But I had been a high school history teacher for 32 years. I knew what desperate people did. I had watched 16-year-olds make choices that followed them for decades because they didn't know how to ask for help. I had watched good people with no good options pick the bad one and then spend years paying for it in ways that had nothing to do with money. I still had a decision to make. My son called that weekend and I could hear it in his voice. He was trying to hold everything together at once and it was getting heavy. His wife was still in the house, but they were barely speaking. He'd moved his home office to the basement. He said it felt like living with a stranger. I asked if he loved her. He said, "Dad, she stole $48,000. "I know," I said. I asked if you loved her. A long silence. "Yes." "Then you need to have the whole conversation, not the one you've been having, the whole one." She went, "Talk to me." "She told me," I said. Another silence. Longer. "Everything," he said. "Yes." I heard him sit down somewhere, the specific sound of a man lowering himself into a chair. "Why would she tell you and not me?" "Because she's ashamed," I said, "and shame makes people talk to the wrong person first. It's always been that way. Doesn't mean she doesn't owe you the same conversation." He asked if I was angry at her. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "but I'm more tired of watching people I love make things worse by not talking to each other." I called my real estate attorney the following week, not because I'd decided to pursue anything, I hadn't, but because I believe in knowing your options before you make a choice. He walked me through it. The money had moved in a way that could support a civil claim, given that my son's communications established the stated purpose of the wire. It wouldn't be simple. It would cost money to recover money. It would take time. And it would take place in documents and depositions that would require both my son and his wife to say terrible things about each other in front of strangers. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "I want my son's marriage to survive," I said. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "That's not really a legal question." "No," I said, "it's not." I went home and wrote a letter. Not to my daughter-in-law, to my son. I told him what she'd told me. The brother, the debt, The secret account. The timeline. I told him she was ashamed, and that shame was making her silent, and that silence was going to do more damage than the original mistake if they let it go on. I told him that $48,000 was real money, and that what she'd done was genuinely wrong, and that none of that cancelled out the fact that she'd done it to protect someone she loved and hadn't known how to ask for help. I mailed it. Actual letter, actual envelope, actual stamp. Eleanor always said some things needed to be said on paper. Then I called my neighbor and told her what I'd done. She said, "You know she still has to answer for it, right? Understanding doesn't mean letting it go." "I know," I said. "I'm not letting it go. I'm giving them a chance to fix it before I have to." My son called me a week later. His voice sounded different. Not better exactly, but more like himself. He said they'd talked. He said it had been a very long night. He said his wife had told him everything, and that he'd asked her why she hadn't come to him, and she'd said because she was afraid he'd think less of her, and he'd said he already thought less of her, and that honesty earlier would have been the better version of this, but that he understood desperation and that he wasn't ready to give up. He also said he wanted the money returned. That was fair. That was the right call. They worked out an arrangement. Her brother, I never met the man, still haven't, would pay back what he could over time. My daughter-in-law would contribute from her earnings directly to an account my son controlled until the $48,000 was restored. No lawyers, no courts, no documents with strangers' signatures. And my son set up an actual account for my roof, which now had a real contractor's name attached to it. The roofer came in March. 4 days of work, new shingles, fixed the flashing around the chimney that was the real source of the bedroom leak. He left, and I walked through the house with him at the end, checked every room. No damage I hadn't already known about. Everything solid. I stood in the bedroom afterward and looked at the ceiling. Dry, white, ordinary. The kind of ceiling you only notice when it's causing problems. My daughter-in-law called that evening. I almost didn't answer. I needed a moment, but I picked up. She said, "I owe you an apology, a real one." "Okay," I said. "I used your house. I used your trust and your son's trust, and I told myself I'd fix it before anyone noticed, and that was wrong. All of it was wrong." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it was taking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I understand what I did." I looked at Eleanor's photo on the dresser. "I appreciate that," I said. "Will you be at Easter?" she asked. I thought about it. "I'll be at Easter." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. I'm not sure forgiveness is one phone call, one letter, one honest conversation over bad diner coffee. I think it's a direction more than a destination, something you walk toward slowly, and some days you cover more ground than others. My son's firm landed a big contract in April. He called to tell me and sounded like himself again, the version of himself I'd been missing. His daughter had started saying full sentences. They'd taken her to the zoo, and she'd asked to see the rhinoceroses, specifically, and nobody knew where she'd learned that word. I laughed at that. Really laughed, the kind that surprises you. My neighbor came over for coffee the following Saturday. I told her about the roof, the call with my daughter-in-law. Easter. She said, "And the $48,000. "Being paid back," I said, slowly, but moving. She nodded and wrapped her hands around her mug, the same way my daughter-in-law had at the diner. I hadn't noticed that until just then. "Do you trust her again?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "I trust that she told me the truth when it mattered," I said. "That's where it starts. The rest takes time." She nodded like that was the right answer. I'm not sure it was. I'm not sure there is a right answer, or if there is, I'm still finding my way to it. Eleanor's photo is still on the dresser. The ceiling above it is dry. The roofer replaced the flashing around the chimney and said I had good bones in this house, said it was built to last. I told him my wife and I bought it in 1995 and that we'd replaced the furnace twice and the water heater once, and that she always said old things that lasted were worth keeping. He said that was a good way to think about it. I think I'm starting to believe him. I've been thinking about that Thanksgiving table a lot lately. The way the room went quiet. The way my daughter-in-law's hand moved toward her purse before a single word of accusation had been spoken. The body already knows what the mind is still trying to hide. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't have predicted when I started asking questions, was how much I'd learn about myself in the process of trying to understand someone else's wrong. She made a bad choice. A serious one. $48,000 is not a rounding error. It's not a misunderstanding. She took money meant for my roof and used it to cover her brother's debts, and she did it without telling a soul. And she let 17 months pass in silence while my son believed the money was sitting in an account somewhere waiting on a contractor's schedule. That's a chain of decisions, not a single mistake. Each one required her to choose dissection again and again and again. But here's what I've come to understand. The consequence of that choice wasn't just financial. It was the slow corrosion of her own character, one small lie at a time. She became someone who flinched at dinner tables and screened phone calls and avoided her father-in-law's eyes at Christmas. She was carrying the weight of it everywhere she went. That's not a punishment anyone else imposed. That's what dishonesty costs, paid in full, daily, by the person doing it. My neighbor asked me early on whether I was going to pursue legal action. I told her I wanted to understand first. She said people with good reasons still make terrible choices, and she was right. But what she didn't say, and what I've learned since, is that understanding someone's reason doesn't require you to absorb the consequence. I could hold both things at once. I understand why you did this, and it still has to be made right. That took something from me, not cleverness. I'm a retired high school teacher, not a detective. What it took was the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to see clearly, to not react when every instinct said react, to write letters instead of making angry phone calls, to meet her in a diner and let her talk instead of arriving with a verdict already written. My son showed something in this too, something I was proud of, even when I didn't say it out loud. He could have ended his marriage over this. Instead, he asked for the truth and then actually listened to it. That takes more strength than most people give it credit for. It's easy to react. It's hard to stay in the room. And my daughter-in-law, I think she's still learning what integrity costs when you've gone without it for a while. Paying back $48,000 slowly, month by month, out of her own earnings, is not a dramatic gesture. It doesn't feel like redemption. It just feels like showing up and doing the hard, unglamorous thing over and over, until the debt is gone and the trust has somewhere to grow again. The roof is fixed, the bedroom ceiling is dry. The contractor said the house had good bones. I've been thinking about that too, about what it means for something old to hold together, about what it takes to repair without tearing down. I don't know if I've fully forgiven her. I know I'm walking in that direction. Some days I cover more ground than others.